and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. I was on watch on a U.S. Coast Guard Lawrence station on Okinawa. It was an isolated duty station on the north end of the island, far enough away from busy areas that nights could feel very long. During the day, the place was mostly quiet. But at night, it had a different kind of silence. The buildings sat apart from everything else, surrounded by darkness, trees, rough ground, and the distant sound of wind moving through the area. There was no city noise, no traffic close by, and no sense that anyone was awake outside of the people assigned to duty. I had been there long enough to understand the normal sounds of the station. Every building has them. Electronics hum. Pipes make noise. Metal expands and contracts as the temperature changes. Old floors creak. Generators make a steady sound in the distance. Doors shift slightly in their frames when the wind is strong. When you work nights in a place like that, you learn what belongs and what does not. That night, I was on watch in the timer room. The Lauren timers were large pieces of equipment, each one roughly the size of a refrigerator. They stood in a row with knobs, dials, panels, lights, and markings that became familiar after enough time around them. The room had the smell of old electronics, dust, warm metal, coffee, and whatever cleaning chemicals had been used earlier in the day. There was a desk where I sat to do my watch duties, and behind the row of timers was an electronics repair area. It was not a large space, but it had enough room for workbenches, tools, spare parts, a coffee pot, and a small trash can. I was alone in the room except for another watchstander nearby. He was in a closed room adjacent to mine, doing his own duties. We were close enough that I knew someone else was there, but not close enough to be talking constantly. It was the middle of the night, the kind of hour when time moves slowly. You check the equipment, make notes, look at the clock, and feel like only 5 minutes have passed, even though it has been much longer. I was sitting at my desk when I heard the first loud bang. It was sharp and sudden, loud enough to make me look up immediately. For a second, I thought something had fallen over behind the timers. It sounded like metal hitting the floor, not like a small tool slipping off a bench. My first thought was that a panel had come loose or some piece of equipment had shifted. It was not unusual for things to rattle a little around machinery, but this was different. This was a real impact. I got up from my desk and walked around the row of timers toward the repair area. When I reached the back of the room, I saw that the metal trash can lid had somehow sailed across the room and landed on the floor. It was not resting close to the trash can. It had traveled a good 20 feet. The lid was lying flat on the ground, and the sound it had made when it hit had been loud enough to carry through the entire room. I stopped and stared at it for a moment. At first, I tried to think of a simple explanation. Maybe it had been balanced badly. Maybe someone had brushed against the trash can earlier and left the lid loose. Maybe vibration from the equipment had caused it to slide off. The station had plenty of large machinery, and vibrations could sometimes travel through the floor or walls in strange ways. Still, the lid had not simply fallen. It had gone across the room. I picked it up, walked back to the trash can, and put it in place. I made sure it was sitting properly. I even pressed it down slightly, just to be certain it was not loose or tilted. Then I looked around the repair area for anything else that might explain it. There was nothing unusual. No open door, no obvious airflow, no fan blowing toward the lid, no loose cables or equipment near it. I went back around the timers and returned to my desk. For a couple of minutes, nothing happened. The room went back to its normal nighttime sounds. The equipment hummed. The lights glowed softly from the panels. Somewhere behind a wall, the building made the small settling noises that old buildings make. I tried to focus on what I was supposed to be doing. I told myself it was probably nothing. Weird things happen around heavy equipment. Things fall. Metal makes noise. It was late, and maybe I had made it seem stranger than it was. Then it happened again. Bang. The sound came from the same direction. I did not jump as much the second time, but I felt a cold, uncomfortable feeling run through my chest. I stood up immediately and walked back around the row of timers. The trash can lid was on the floor again. This time, it was not just a little distance away from the can. It had traveled across the room again, landing in nearly the same general area as before. I remember looking from the lid to the trash can and back again, trying to understand how it could happen twice. I walked over and picked it up. There was nothing special about the lid. It was just an ordinary round metal trash can lid. It was not attached to a string. There was no one hiding behind the equipment. There was no sudden gust of wind. The room was closed off, and the air was still. I checked the can itself. It was not dented enough to spring the lid off. It was not sitting on uneven ground. Everything looked normal. I replaced it again. This time, I stood there for a few seconds after putting it back. I watched it. I waited for it to move. I looked toward the repair benches, toward the coffee pot, toward the dark edges of the room behind the equipment. Nothing happened. Then I went back to my desk. I had barely settled down when the third bang came. Bang, it was the same sound, heavy and metallic, only now it felt personal. I got up again, but I moved more slowly. I did not want to admit it, but by then I was uneasy. 3 times was too much to laugh off. A lid falling once could be an accident. Twice was strange. 3 times in the same way made it hard to keep telling yourself it was normal. I walked around the timers and found the lid on the floor again. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at it. The room felt different than it had a few minutes earlier. Nothing had changed physically. The equipment was still running. The lights were still on. The coffee pot was still sitting near the work area, but the silence felt heavier. It was no longer the normal quiet of a watch station in the middle of the night. It felt like there was something in the room with me, something I could not see, but could somehow sense. I picked up the lid. I started walking toward the trash can to replace it for the 3rd time. That was when I noticed the spoons. Near the coffee pot, there was a water glass with several spoons sitting inside it. They were the kind of ordinary spoons people used for coffee, left there after stirring sugar or powdered creamer. As I walked past, the spoons suddenly stood upright in the glass and began rattling back and forth. Not falling over, not slipping, standing up. They moved against the sides of the glass, clinking rapidly as if someone was shaking them. The sound was small compared to the trash can lid, but somehow it was much worse. The metal-on-glass noise was sharp and quick. The spoons tapped and rattled against one another as they moved back and forth. I froze. For 1 second, I could not make myself move. Then I reached toward them. I do not know exactly what I thought I was going to do. Maybe I thought I could stop them. Maybe I thought touching the glass would prove there was some simple physical cause. Maybe I just reacted without thinking. Before I could grab them, a salt shaker on the counter tipped over. It did not fall as if it had been bumped by my arm. I was not close enough to touch it. It tipped over on its own, slowly at first, then hit the counter on its side. I watched the lid unscrew. That was the moment I knew I was seeing something I could not explain. The metal lid on the salt shaker began to turn as I watched it. It did not pop off all at once. It twisted loose, one small turn at a time, until it came free. Then the salt started pouring out onto the counter. I remember staring at it, unable to say anything. The spoons had stopped rattling by then. The glass was still. The salt shaker was lying on its side, its lid beside it, with a small pile of salt spreading across the surface. I was still holding the trash can lid. I had not even put it back yet. At that point, I did not want to be in the repair area anymore. I was not thinking about explanations. I was not thinking about equipment vibrations, air pressure, or anything else logical. I just wanted to get back to my desk where there was more open space, where I could see the rest of the room. I started walking back around the row of timers. The timers blocked my view of the desk for a few seconds as I moved. I remember being aware of that. I remember wanting to get around them quickly so I could see the room again. As soon as I cleared the end of the timer row, I saw the plastic paper tray fly off my desk. It did not slide. It did not tip over slowly. It flew. The tray came off the desk as if someone had picked it up and thrown it. It sailed 8 or 10 feet across the room and hit the floor. Papers went everywhere. Some scattered under the desk. Some landed near the timers. Some slid across the floor and stopped near my boots. I stood there holding the metal trash can lid, staring at the mess. For a moment, nothing moved. The paper tray lay on the floor. The papers were spread across the room. The salt was still on the counter. The spoons sat quietly in the glass. The trash can lid was still in my hands. Then, everything stopped. Just like that. No more bangs, no more rattling, no more things moving. The room returned to silence. I did not feel relieved. I felt worse, because now I was waiting for something else to happen. I kept expecting the tray to move again, or the spoons to start rattling, or the trash can lid to fly out of my hands. I stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the equipment hum and trying to decide what to do. Eventually, I called the executive officer. I was not someone who wanted to wake people up in the middle of the night for nothing. On a duty station, you learn not to make a big deal out of minor issues. But this did not feel minor. I told the SO what had happened. I do not remember every word I used, but I know I tried to sound calm and factual. I told him about the trash can lid. I told him about the spoons. I told him about the salt shaker and the paper tray. He got out of bed and came up to the timer room with the duty engineer. By the time they arrived, everything was still. The room looked almost normal, except for the papers on the floor. The salt spilled beside the coffee pot, and the tray lying where it had landed. The trash can lid was back in place by then. I had put it on the can after the last event, though I remember doing it carefully, almost like I was afraid to let go of it. The SO and the engineer looked around the room. They checked the trash can. They looked at the paper tray. They glanced at the spoons and the salt shaker. They walked around the timers. They looked toward the repair area. Neither of them said much. What I remember most was the way they looked at me. Not in a cruel way, exactly. More like they were trying to decide whether I was serious. They stood around for maybe 10 minutes, looking around the room and then looking back at me sideways. I could tell they did not know what to make of it. The SO eventually went back to bed. The duty engineer went back to his watch station near the generators, and I stayed in the timer room. Nothing else happened that night. Nothing happened the next night either. In fact, Nothing like that ever happened again for the rest of the 13 months I was stationed there. People joked about it afterward, of course. I got ribbed a few times. Someone would ask if I had been seeing things. Somebody else would joke that maybe I had been smoking funny tobacco while I was on watch. That was the kind of thing people said when they did not know how to talk about something strange. It was easier to make a joke than to admit that something had happened that made no sense. I did not argue much. I knew what I had seen. I had seen the trash can lid cross the room 3 separate times. I had watched the spoons move in the water glass. I had watched the salt shaker tip over and its lid unscrew. I had watched the paper tray fly off my desk. No one could convince me that I had imagined all of it. Years later, I stayed in touch online with an electronics technician who had been stationed there around the same time. He later did another tour at the same place a few years after I had left. At some point, we were talking about old memories from the station, and I mentioned the night in the timer room. He told me something that made the whole thing feel even stranger. During his second tour, some of the local people who worked at the station would not go into that building. They said it was haunted. They did not say it as a joke. They genuinely avoided the place. According to him, there were people who had their own stories, their own reasons for not wanting to be inside after dark. I never learned every detail. Maybe they had heard noises. Maybe they had seen things move. Maybe they had felt the same heavy, uncomfortable feeling that I had felt that night. I cannot prove what happened in that timer room. Maybe there was some natural explanation that I never understood. Maybe vibrations, pressure changes, or something in the building caused a chain of strange events at exactly the wrong time. Maybe there was a mechanical explanation for every object that moved, but I have thought about it for years, and I still cannot make it fit. A metal trash can lid does not normally fly 20 feet across a room 3 times. Spoons do not normally stand upright in a glass and rattle on their own. A salt shaker does not normally tip over, unscrew itself, and pour salt onto a counter while someone watches. And a plastic paper tray does not usually lift from a desk and sail through the air as if an unseen person threw it. Whatever happened that night, it only happened once. That almost makes it worse. For 13 months, I worked in that same place. I sat at that same desk. I walked around those same timers. I drank coffee near that same repair area. I heard the normal sounds of the station night after night. But every time I was alone in that room after midnight, I remembered the sound of that first bang. And for a long time after, whenever I heard metal shift or papers move in the air conditioning, part of me waited to see if it would happen again. One night, a little less than 3 years ago, I was with my husband while he was locking up the cigar shop he managed. It was already past 10 p.m., and the shop had been closed for a while by then. Most nights, I would wait for him to finish his closing work so we could leave together. I had been there enough times that I knew the routine. The customers would slowly clear out near closing time. The front doors would be locked, the cash counted, the chairs straightened, and then my husband would go through the building, making sure everything was clean and secure. The shop itself had a very specific feeling at night. During the day, it was busy enough that you did not think much about the building. There were people coming and going, regulars sitting around talking, the smell of cigars and smoke hanging in the air, music playing somewhere in the background, and the sound of glasses or chairs moving. It was one of those places where the same people showed up often enough that everyone knew each other by name. Some came in just to buy cigars, but others treated it more like a private club. They would sit for hours, drink, smoke, tell stories, talk business, complain about work, and act like they owned the place. Upstairs was the members' lounge. It was a private area in the back of the shop where the regular bigwigs liked to sit and smoke or drink. It was more comfortable than the rest of the shop, with heavier furniture, dimmer lighting, and that deep, stale smell of old smoke that never really left the walls. During business hours, it could be lively. The people who used it were usually loud, friendly, and full of opinions. But after closing, when everyone had gone home, the lounge felt completely different. It was not exactly scary at first. It was just too quiet. The shop had a long hallway upstairs that led toward the lounge. The hallway was narrow enough that footsteps carried through it, especially when the building was empty. There were doors along parts of it, storage areas, offices, and rooms that were usually left dark after closing. Once the lights were turned off, the hallway became almost completely black. You could stand in the lounge and look toward the doorway, but beyond it, there was only darkness. That night, my husband was finishing up his cleaning. My friend and I were sitting in the lounge, talking quietly while we waited. We had both been there for a while, and neither of us was in any rush. The three of us were completely alone as far as we knew. All the customers had left at closing time. The front door was locked. The downstairs lights were off. The building was closed. There was another friend with us that night, too, but the important part was that all three of us were within sight of one another. My husband was near the back of the lounge, cleaning the floor. My friend and I were sitting nearby, talking about something I cannot even remember now. It must have been something ordinary, because we were relaxed. We were not telling ghost stories or talking about anything creepy. It was just the normal end of a long night. The lights were off everywhere except the room we were in. That was normal for closing. My husband had already shut down most of the building, so the lounge was the only place with enough light to see clearly. The hallway outside the lounge was dark. The stairs were dark. The front of the shop was dark. The only light came from the warm, dim lamps inside the lounge, and it stopped right at the open doorway. At some point, the conversation between my friend and me slowed down. My husband was moving the mop across the floor in long, quiet strokes. The shop was so still that we could hear the mop dragging lightly over the surface. We could hear the bucket wheels shift when he pulled it closer. We could hear the building settling in the cold night air. Then we heard footsteps. At first, I did not fully understand what I was hearing. The sound came from the dark hallway outside the lounge. It was heavy and slow, not the quick light sound of someone moving around in sneakers. It sounded like someone in work boots, or someone with a solid, heavy step, walking down the hall toward us. One step, then another, then another. All three of us stopped what we were doing. My friend stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. My husband paused with the mop in his hands. I remember looking toward the doorway before I even realized I was doing it. The footsteps were clear. They were not coming from downstairs. They were not coming from outside. They were not the sound of a car door closing or someone passing the building. They were inside the shop, in the hallway, and they were moving in our direction. For a second, I thought maybe a customer had somehow stayed behind. Maybe someone had been in one of the rooms upstairs and we had not noticed. The members' lounge had regulars who could be there for hours, and sometimes people stayed later than they should have. Maybe someone had been sitting in another area, sleeping in a chair or talking on the phone. But that did not make much sense. My husband had already checked the building. The front door was locked. Everyone had left. The footsteps continued. Heavy, slow, steady, they came closer and closer down the hallway. We could hear the exact rhythm of them now. Whoever was walking was not running. They were not sneaking. They were walking calmly, like they knew where they were going. That was what made it worse. It sounded intentional. I looked at my husband. He was staring toward the doorway. He had a strange expression on his face. Not panic exactly, but something close to it. My friend looked at me, and I could tell from her face that she had heard the same thing I had. No one said a word. The footsteps got closer. The hallway was dark, but we expected someone to appear at any second. Even if the person was standing in the shadows, they would have to enter the doorway eventually. They would have to step into the light. One more step, then another. Then the footsteps stopped. They stopped right at the doorway of the lounge. We all froze. The doorway was open. There was no door to close between us and the hallway. The warm light from the lounge reached just far enough to show the edge of the floor outside, but beyond that was pure darkness. I stared at the empty space, waiting for someone to step forward. No one did. There was no face, no body, no shadow, no voice asking if we were still open. Nothing. The silence that came after the footsteps was worse than the footsteps themselves. I remember the feeling of my body tightening up. It was like I had stopped breathing without meaning to. My friend sat completely still beside me. My husband was still holding the mop, staring at the doorway as if he expected something to come through at any moment. The strange part was that we had all heard it clearly. There was no chance that only one person had imagined it. 3 people heard those steps coming down that hallway. They were heavy enough that they seemed to shake the quiet of the building. The person, or whatever it was, had walked directly toward us and stopped at the entrance. But the doorway was empty. My husband dropped the mop. It hit the floor with a loud crack that made all of us jump. Then he moved quickly toward the door. I remember wanting to tell him not to go, but I did not say anything. He was the manager, and he was used to checking the building. Maybe he thought there was a real person there. Maybe he thought someone had gotten locked inside. Maybe he simply needed to know what had made that sound. He stepped out of the lounge and into the hallway. My friend and I stayed where we were, watching him. The light from the lounge hit his back and shoulders, but after a few steps, he was almost swallowed by the darkness. He reached toward the wall and turned on a light in the hallway. The sudden brightness made both of us blink. The hallway was empty. There was no one standing there. No one at the far end. No one near the stairs. No one coming out of one of the rooms. My husband walked down the hall, checking every place where someone could have been hiding. He looked into the nearby rooms. He checked the bathroom. He looked around the stairwell. He went farther than I expected him to go, moving through the dark parts of the shop as if he was determined to prove it was nothing. But when he came back, his face had changed. There was no one there. He told us that the hallway was empty. Not just empty at that moment. Empty in the way that made no sense after hearing someone walk through it. There was nowhere someone could have gone without being seen or heard. The stairs were near the hallway, and he would have heard someone going down them. The rooms were empty. The back areas were empty. The shop was locked. My friend and I both asked him if he was sure. He said yes. Then, without any discussion, he started cleaning faster. The slow, careful closing routine was over. He did not finish the way he normally did. He moved quickly, picked up the mop, dumped out the bucket, checked what he needed to check, and started gathering his things. My friend and I did not complain or tease him about it. We were ready to leave, too. The energy in the room had changed completely. Before the footsteps, we had been relaxed. Afterward, every small noise seemed threatening. The refrigerator downstairs turning on sounded too loud. A pipe shifting somewhere in the wall made us look toward the hallway. The building settling made all of us go quiet again. None of us wanted to be upstairs anymore. My husband finished whatever had to be done, locked the necessary doors, and we headed out together. We stayed close as we walked through the shop. The lights were still off in most places, and the shadows felt deeper than usual. We passed the front displays, the empty chairs, the glass cases, and the dark windows. The whole shop smelled like smoke and old wood, but that night it felt heavier than normal. When we finally got outside, I felt relieved immediately. The parking lot was empty. The street outside was quiet. There was nothing unusual there. No person standing nearby. No sign that anyone had been trying to get into the shop. We got into the car and left, but the three of us kept talking about what happened. We all described the footsteps the same way, heavy, slow, coming down the hallway, stopping at the doorway. It was not something we could easily brush off. After that night, I paid more attention to the stories people told about the shop. My husband had worked there long enough to hear plenty of strange things. He had a name for whatever he believed was in the building. He called it Carl. He called it a demon sometimes, though I do not know if he meant that seriously every time, or if it was his way of making sense of the strange things that happened there. According to him, Carl had been around before I ever started spending time at the shop. People who worked late had heard noises upstairs. Some said they heard footsteps when they knew they were alone. Others said they would leave something in one place and come back to find it moved. Small things, mostly. A lighter that was not where it had been. A chair slightly out of place. A glass that had been left on a table but was found somewhere else later. Nothing big enough to prove anything, but enough to make people uncomfortable. Regulars had stories, too. The people who spent the most time in the lounge were the ones who seemed least surprised when someone mentioned strange noises. A few of them would laugh and say that the building had always been weird. Others would get quiet and say they had heard something upstairs after everyone else had gone home. Some had seen shadows in the hall. Some had heard movement in rooms they knew were empty. There was one regular in particular who spent a lot of time there. He was the kind of person everyone knew. He had his usual seat, his usual drink, his usual cigars. He was part of the furniture in that place. You could walk into the lounge and expect to see him there, leaning back in a chair, smoking and talking like he had nowhere else to be. He was not a scary person. He was just a regular. But he had a strong connection to the shop. He loved that place. He had his routines, his friends, and his favorite spot upstairs. For him, it was more than a cigar shop. It was somewhere he belonged. A place where he could sit, relax, talk, and feel known. Some months after the footsteps incident, he passed away. He did not die at the shop. As far as I know, there was nothing dramatic or strange about the way he died. But after he was gone, something changed in the building. Carl stopped doing things. The noises became less common. People stopped mentioning footsteps upstairs. Things stopped being moved around. The strange feeling in the lounge faded. It was not like the building became completely normal overnight. Old buildings always make sounds, and people still told stories. But that strong, uncomfortable feeling, the sense that something was moving around upstairs after closing, seemed to disappear. My husband and I talked about it more than once. We wondered if maybe Carl was never some demon at all. Maybe it had been that regular. Maybe whatever people had been hearing was tied to him somehow. Maybe he spent so much time in the shop that part of him stayed connected to it. Maybe after he passed away, his spirit went back there one last time to sit in his usual place, have one final smoke, and then leave. I know that sounds strange, and I do not claim to know what really happened. Maybe the footsteps had a perfectly normal explanation. Maybe someone had been in the building without us realizing it. Maybe the sound carried in a weird way through the walls. Maybe the shop had pipes, floorboards, or an old heating system that made sounds that resembled footsteps. But 3 people heard those steps. All 3 of us heard them approach. All 3 of us heard them stop at the doorway. And when my husband checked, there was nobody there. That was the part I could never forget. Not the darkness. Not the shop. Not even the stories about Carl. It was the sound of those heavy footsteps coming down that empty hallway, getting closer and closer, until they stopped right outside the lounge where we were sitting. Then nothing. Just silence. And an empty doorway. I lived with 4 roommates during university in an old Victorian-style house that always made me feel a little uneasy. It was a beautiful house in the way old houses can be beautiful. From the outside, it had character that newer places never seemed to have. It had tall windows, old woodwork, uneven floors, large rooms, and the kind of shape that made you imagine all the people who had lived there before you. But even though it was interesting and had its own charm, there was something about it that always gave me the creeps. Nothing obvious happened right away. It was more of a feeling. The house was old enough that it made plenty of normal noises. Floors creaked, pipes knocked, doors shifted when the temperature changed. The heating system had its own strange sounds, and sometimes the wind would make the windows rattle. Living there with 5 people also meant there was almost always some kind of noise happening. Someone was showering. Someone was cooking. Someone had music playing in their room. Someone was walking up and down the stairs. Or someone was coming home late. But even with all of that, there were certain moments when the house felt too quiet. It had a basement, an upstairs, long hallways, and rooms that seemed to hold on to darkness, even during the day. At night, when everyone's bedroom doors were shut and the common areas were empty, the place felt much bigger than it actually was. The staircase seemed longer. The hallway outside the bedroom seemed darker. The basement door always looked like it led somewhere deeper than a normal basement should be. I never told anyone at first that the house made me uncomfortable because I did not want to sound dramatic. We were university students living in an old rental. Of course it creaked. Of course it had weird corners and cold drafts. It was easy to explain the feeling away. Then, one evening, 2 of my roommates were home alone and heard whistling. They told the rest of us about it later. At the time, I did not think much of it. They said they had been downstairs, probably watching television or hanging out in the living room, when they heard someone whistling upstairs. It was not just a quick sound or someone blowing air through their teeth. It was a tune, a real melodic tune, like someone quietly whistling a song to themselves. They said it echoed through the house. At first, they assumed one of us had come home. That was the most logical explanation. Maybe someone had entered quietly, gone upstairs, and was walking around in their room. Maybe someone was in the bathroom. Maybe one of us had headphones on and was absent-mindedly whistling. But they checked. Nobody else was home. They called out, thinking someone might have come in without them noticing. There was no answer. They went upstairs and looked through the rooms. Nothing. They checked the main floor, the hallway, and probably even the basement. But there was no person there. The whistling had stopped by the time they started looking. When they told us about it, it became one of those roommate stories that people laugh about a little. Everyone has weird things happen in an old house. Someone hears a sound, someone thinks they see something move, someone gets nervous because they are alone at night. I remember listening and thinking they'd probably heard something from outside. Maybe someone had been walking past the house. Maybe a neighbor was whistling. Maybe the sound came through the vents or from another building. Maybe it was just the wind making a strange noise that their brains turned into a tune. I did not really believe it was anything supernatural. At least, not then. A few months later, I had my own experience. It was one of those university nights where everyone else had gone to bed, but I was still awake trying to finish a paper. I had probably waited until the last minute, like most students do, and suddenly found myself sitting at my laptop late at night with an assignment due soon. The house was quiet around me. All my roommates had gone to sleep. Their bedroom doors were shut. The lights in the common areas were off. I was alone with the small glow of my laptop screen and whatever lamp I had on in my room. I remember working for hours. At first, I had background noise playing quietly. Maybe music, maybe a video, maybe just the sound of typing and pages being moved around on my desk. But eventually, I got tired enough that I could barely focus. Around 2 in the morning, I finally shut my laptop down. The screen went black. The room got darker. And suddenly, the house felt completely silent. I got into bed, pulled the blankets up, and tried to settle down after staring at a screen for too long. My mind was still busy with whatever I had been writing, and I remember lying there in that restless state where you are exhausted but not quite asleep yet. Then I heard it, whistling. It was crystal clear. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was a sound from outside. Maybe someone was walking home late. Maybe a car passed by with music playing. But then it happened again. A tune. A slow, creepy melody. It was not loud, but it was distinct enough that I could hear every part of it. It sounded like someone was whistling inside the house. I froze. The first thing I thought about was what my roommates had told us months earlier. The whistling, the tune, the fact that they had heard it in the house when nobody else was there. I stayed completely still and listened. The whistling continued. It seemed to come from downstairs at first, maybe from the basement or from the bottom part of the house. It was hard to tell because old houses carry sound in strange ways. A noise can come from one room and seem like it is right outside your door. But I could hear the tune moving. That was the part that scared me. It was not staying in one place. It sounded like it started somewhere low in the house, almost as if it was coming from the basement. Then it seemed to move upward. The melody echoed through the floorboards and hallway. It sounded farther away for a moment, then closer. It felt like someone was slowly walking through the house while whistling. I remember holding my breath without realizing it. The tune repeated. Again and again. It was not a song I recognized. It had a rhythm to it, but it was not cheerful. It was not the kind of tune someone would whistle while doing dishes or getting ready for work. It sounded slow and wrong, like it belonged in a horror movie. I lay there, listening to it move. At one point, it seemed like it was coming from the hallway outside my room. Then, it sounded like it had moved farther upstairs. Then, it was near the basement again. I could not understand how that was possible. Everyone was asleep. I knew where my roommates were. Their rooms were closed. Nobody had gotten up. Nobody was walking through the house. I did not hear doors opening or closing. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear anyone laughing or talking. Just whistling. A clear melodic tune moving through an otherwise silent house. I wanted to get up and check. Part of me thought maybe one of my roommates was messing with me. Maybe someone had heard me shut my laptop, waited until I got into bed, and decided to make the whistling story into a joke. That would have been annoying, but at least it would have been normal. But another part of me did not want to open my door. I did not want to step into the hallway and find someone standing there. I did not want to look down the stairs toward the dark main floor. I did not want to go near the basement. So, I stayed in bed. The tune kept repeating. It felt like it went on for a long time. though it may have only been a few minutes. Fear makes time stretch. Every time the melody repeated, I felt more certain that it was coming from inside the house. I listened for the sound of wind outside. I listened for the furnace. I tried to convince myself it was a pipe or some kind of vibration, but nothing normal made sense. It sounded like a person. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Not slowly, not fading away as if someone had walked farther down the street. It just stopped. One moment, the whistling was there. The next moment, the house was silent. I waited. I kept listening for another note, a footstep, a door, anything. Nothing happened. That should have made me feel better, but it did not. It was almost worse, because I had no idea why it stopped. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring into the dark and trying not to imagine the tune starting again. Every little sound made me tense up. The heater coming on, a floorboard creaking, a car passing outside, someone turning over in bed upstairs. I did not sleep at all. By morning, the house looked normal again. Sunlight came through the windows. Someone made coffee. Someone was probably rushing to class. The kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of roommates getting ready for the day. I remember mentioning the whistling. The two roommates who had heard it before immediately knew what I meant. Their faces changed when I described the tune. I remember them saying it sounded like the same thing they had heard. That was when it stopped feeling like a random sound. It had happened before. Other people had heard it. And now I had heard it too. The strange thing was that it happened in winter. All the windows were shut. There was no open window for a person outside to whistle through. There was no warm weather breeze coming in. The doors were locked. The house was sealed up as much as an old drafty Victorian house can be in the winter. The whistling was definitely inside. At least, that is how it felt. Maybe there was some strange acoustic effect. Maybe wind moved through part of the house in a way that created a melody. Maybe the furnace or pipes made a sound that repeated. Maybe there was some mechanical issue that made noise travel from the basement through the walls and upstairs. That would be the logical explanation. But it did not sound mechanical. It did not sound like wind. It sounded like someone whistling a tune and walking around the house. After that, I did not like being awake alone in the house at night. I started leaving lights on when I had to work late. I avoided sitting near the basement door. I would check that the doors were locked more than once before bed. I did not tell myself the house was haunted, because I did not want to believe that. But I was more aware of it. The house had always made me uneasy. Now it felt like there was a reason. About a year later, something else happened. By then, we had all been living in the house long enough that the old noises had become familiar. You start learning the personality of a place. You know which step on the stairs creaks. You know which door sticks in damp weather. You know the sound of pipes in the walls. You know when the furnace makes a loud knock before it starts. The house was still creepy sometimes, but we had gotten used to it. Then, one night, all 5 of us were woken up by a loud crash in the bathroom. It was one of those sounds that instantly gets you out of bed. Not a small bump, not something falling gently off a shelf. A full, loud crashing sound, like someone had knocked over half the bathroom. We all woke up around the same time. At first, there was confusion. People opened their doors. Someone asked what happened. Someone else thought maybe a pipe had burst or something had broken. The sound had been loud enough that it carried through the entire house. We rushed toward the bathroom. When we got there, every shampoo bottle, body wash bottle, conditioner bottle, and random shower product was lying in the bottom of the tub. There were 5 of us living in that house, so the shower was crowded with products. Everyone had their own shampoo, conditioner, body wash, face wash, shaving gel, maybe extra bottles they had bought and forgotten about. There were probably around 15 different bottles in there altogether. Normally, they were placed in different spots. Some were on the little shower shelf. Some were on the edge of the tub. Some were balanced on corners or wedged into spaces where people had made room for their things. It was messy, but it was a normal shared bathroom mess. That night, every single bottle was in the bottom of the shower tub. All of them. Not just one bottle that had slipped. Not just a shelf that had fallen down. Not a few bottles rolling off because someone bumped the wall. Every bottle had been knocked down into the tub. We stood there looking at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shower shelves were still there. Nothing looked broken. There was no obvious reason everything should have fallen at once. If a shelf had come loose, that might explain a handful of bottles. If someone had accidentally hit the shower curtain or bumped the wall hard, maybe a few things could have fallen. But all of them? From different places? At the same time? It did not make sense. I remember one of us joking that the ghost was angry about our shower products. Someone else probably said it was the house settling. Someone suggested maybe the vibrations from something outside shook them loose, but nobody really believed their own explanation. We had all heard the crash. We had all seen the tub. And we all knew how the bottles had been arranged before. The bathroom was small, and the shower was not exactly organized, but there was no way all 15 bottles should have ended up in the bottom of the tub at once without something causing it. I remember looking around the room after that. The bathroom light was on. The shower curtain was partly open. The bottles were scattered in the tub, some lying on their sides, some standing upright, some pressed against the drain. Everything else was normal. There was no broken shelf, no water dripping from the ceiling, no sign that something had fallen from above, no one hiding behind the shower curtain. Just a tub full of bottles and 5 roommates standing there in the middle of the night, trying not to say out loud what we were all thinking. The house had done something again. Maybe there was a normal explanation for both incidents. Maybe the whistling had come from pipes, vents, or wind. Maybe the bottles had all fallen because of a slight shift in the shower shelving, moisture, vibrations, or bad balancing. Old houses are unpredictable. Shared bathrooms are cluttered. Sounds travel strangely. Things fall. I understand that. But what made the experiences unsettling was not just the events themselves. It was the timing, the way they happened, and the fact that multiple people experienced them. The whistling was not just one person being tired or imagining something. 2 roommates heard it first. Later, I heard it alone, and it sounded like the same tune. Then the bottles crashed in the bathroom and woke all 5 of us. No one could say they had been dreaming. No one could say they were the only witness. That house always felt a little off. The whistling made it feel occupied. The bathroom incident made it feel like something in the house could interact with the physical world, even if only in small and strange ways. I do not know what happened there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe every weird sound and every fallen bottle had an ordinary explanation that we never figured out. Maybe living in an old Victorian house with 4 other university students made us more likely to notice strange things and turn them into stories. But I still remember lying in bed at 2 in the morning, hearing that clear melody drift from the basement to the upstairs hallway. I still remember the tune stopping, all at once. And I still remember standing in the bathroom with all my roommates, looking down at a shower tub full of bottles that had somehow fallen together in the middle of the night. After that, I never thought of that house as just an old rental again. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. When I was in basic training at Fort Sill, there were stories going around about the barracks almost from the beginning. Nobody knew what was true and what had been changed by people talking. That is how it always is in a place like basic training. You are exhausted, isolated from normal life, surrounded by strangers, and living in the same building with hundreds of other people who are all stressed out, sleep-deprived, scared of getting yelled at, and trying not to make mistakes. Rumors spread fast. Someone hears something from another bay, tells their battle buddy, then somebody else adds a detail. By the end of the day, a story that may have started with a single incident becomes something everybody knows happened. The stories at Fort Sill were about suicides. People said there had been multiple suicides in our barracks over the years. Some people claimed there had been several. Others said there were specific rooms people did not like to sleep in. The story that stuck with everyone was that a female drill sergeant had died there too. Nobody could ever tell you the exact details with confidence. It was always, "I heard this happened," or "someone from another platoon told me," or "a guy who was here before us said it was true." There were no official announcements. Nobody in charge ever came in and said, "Yes, this is what happened in this building." It was all passed around through whispers, late-night conversations, and the kind of bored fear that grows when people are too tired to think straight. Still, once the story was in your head, it was hard to ignore. The barracks already felt strange at night. During the day, there was too much going on to think about anything else. You were being yelled at, running somewhere, cleaning something, standing in formation, learning rules, getting smoked, trying to remember what you were supposed to be doing next, and hoping you did not become the person who got everyone punished. There was always noise. Boots on the floor. Lockers slamming. People rushing into formation. Drill sergeants shouting. People whispering instructions under their breath. The sound of bodies moving through the bay before the sun was even up. But at night, after lights out, the place changed. The same open barracks bay that felt crowded and loud during the day became long, dark, and almost too quiet. You could hear every small sound. Someone turning over in their rack. A blanket shifting. A cough from the other end of the room. A locker door clicking slightly. Boots sitting under beds. The faint hum of whatever equipment kept the building running. And then there was fire guard. Fire guard was one of the worst parts of basic training because it came when you were already running on almost no sleep. You would finally get into bed, your body would start shutting down. And then you had to wake up in the middle of the night for your shift. You had to stay awake, move through the bay, make sure nobody was doing something they should not be doing, watch the doors, watch the hallways, and make sure the building was not on fire or falling apart. At least, that was how it felt. You would be standing there in the dark, trying not to nod off, listening to everyone breathe and shift in their beds. Every shadow looked like something. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The moment you stopped moving, your body tried to fall asleep standing up. That is when weird things started happening. People would get up and start doing push-ups. Not in the normal way where someone woke up before PT or decided to punish themselves because they remembered something they did wrong. They would get up in the middle of the night during someone else's fire guard shift and start doing push-ups like they had been told to. The problem was, they were not really awake. You would see someone sit up fast, climb down from their rack, drop to the floor, and start doing push-ups. Sometimes they would mumble something. Sometimes they would look half-conscious. Sometimes they would move with the stiff, automatic rhythm of someone who was following an order they could hear, but nobody else could. You would ask them what they were doing. They would not answer. You would tell them to get back in bed. Sometimes they would snap awake and look confused, like they had no idea why they were on the floor. Other times they would keep going for a few more seconds before finally coming around. Then they would say something like, "Drill sergeant told me to." Except there had been no drill sergeant in the bay. At first, most people blamed lack of sleep. That made sense. Everyone was exhausted. Basic training messes with your sleep, your sense of time, your nerves, and your ability to think. People had dreams where drill sergeants were yelling at them. People woke up thinking they had overslept. People would sit upright in bed and start getting dressed before realizing it was still the middle of the night. That part was not unusual. The strange part was how many people did it, and the way they all described the same thing. There were stories of trainees getting up and running laps around the bay because they believed a drill sergeant had ordered them to. They would get out of bed, start moving fast around the room, and look completely serious. Not laughing, not messing around, not trying to cause trouble. They would act like they were being corrected by someone standing right in front of them. Some would stop only when the fire guard grabbed them or yelled at them. Then they would look around, confused and embarrassed, and ask where the drill sergeant went. The description was always similar. A female drill sergeant, short black hair. A woman standing in the bay giving orders. That was the part that made people uncomfortable, because the rumor about the female drill sergeant who died in the barracks had been around long before some of those people started seeing her. Maybe they had heard the story, and it got into their dreams. That is the logical explanation. When you are exhausted, your brain can blend dreams and reality. If you have been told a ghost story about a female drill sergeant, and then you wake up at 2 in the morning in a dark barracks, your mind can make her appear. But it was still creepy to watch, especially when you were awake, especially when you were the one on fire guard. I had my own experience one night. I woke up suddenly because I thought a drill sergeant had walked into the bay. It was one of those instant wake-ups where your body reacts before your mind catches up. I was asleep. Then suddenly I was wide awake, staring into the dark, convinced someone important had entered the room. You learn very quickly in basic training to react to drill sergeants. You do not sleep through them if you can help it. You do not ignore them. You do not pretend they are not there. Your whole body gets trained to respond when you hear boots, shouting, a door opening, or the sound of someone walking into a room with authority. That night I woke up because I was sure someone had come in. I lay completely still in my bed. I did not move. I did not sit up. I did not speak. I just listened. I expected to hear someone yell. I expected lights to come on. I expected someone to start screaming at us, to get out of bed, to get dressed, to get on the floor, to start doing push-ups, to explain why nobody was on fire guard. But nothing happened. The barracks was quiet. I stayed still for what felt like a long time. Maybe it was half an hour. Maybe it was less. But it felt like half an hour because I was waiting for someone to explode into the room and start chewing us out. I kept expecting a voice. I kept expecting footsteps. I kept expecting the sound of boots moving across the floor. Nothing came. Eventually, I looked around more carefully. That was when I realized nobody was on fire guard. The people who were supposed to be awake had not gotten up. The fire guard shift had been missed. At first, I thought that was impossible. Someone was always supposed to be up. There were rules, there was a schedule. People got in trouble for missing it. But apparently, the guys assigned to that shift never woke up. They slept through it. And somehow, I had woken up at the exact time I thought a drill sergeant entered the bay. I did not know what to make of it. Maybe I heard something in my sleep. Maybe a door opened somewhere else in the building. Maybe another bay had a drill sergeant come through, and the sound carried. Maybe someone rolled over in their bed or bumped a locker, and my brain turned it into the sound of a drill sergeant entering. But in that moment, it felt real. It felt like someone had come into the room. I was not the only one either. Later, we found out that 3 guys from other bays in the same barracks had the same thing happen. Different rooms, same night, same general experience. They woke up because they thought a drill sergeant had come in. They stayed still, waiting for something to happen. Then they realized no one was actually there. And in some of those bays, the fire guard had not been up either. That was when the stories started getting worse. People were already talking about the woman with short black hair. Now people were saying she was making sure a fire guard was awake, or that she was checking the bays, or that she was still doing what drill sergeants do, walking through the building and making sure nobody was slacking. It sounds ridiculous when you say it in daylight, but in the middle of basic training, exhausted, surrounded by people who all heard the same stories, it did not feel ridiculous. It felt possible. The next night, another group of people freaked out because they thought the fire alarm had gone off. 5 guys woke up convinced they heard the alarm. They were reacting like it was real. Some sat upright. Some started moving around. Some were looking toward the exits. The problem was that there was no alarm going off. No lights. No flashing signal. No actual sound that everyone could hear. Just a few people suddenly awake and panicked because they thought they had heard it. Again, you could blame sleep deprivation. Maybe they were dreaming the same kind of thing because of stress. Maybe one person woke up and made a sound, then the others woke up confused. Maybe a noise from another part of the building sounded like an alarm through a dream. But 5 people had the same reaction. That was hard to ignore. Then there was the latrine incident. The night after the fire alarm thing, people on fire guard heard loud bangs coming from the latrine. Not little pipes knocking, not a faucet dripping, not someone dropping a soap bottle. Loud bangs. The kind that make you turn around and look toward the bathroom immediately. There were 5 people on fire guard at different points of the shift. Only about half of them heard the bangs. The others heard nothing at all. That made it worse. If everyone heard it, you could say something fell or a pipe made noise. If nobody heard it, you could say someone imagined it. But some people heard loud banging in the latrine, while others standing nearby heard nothing. The people who heard it said it sounded like something hitting the stalls or walls. They went to check. Nothing. The latrine was empty. No one had been in there. No broken fixtures. No obvious source. Just the smell of cleaning supplies, the dim light, rows of sinks, the stalls, and silence. After that, nobody liked going to the latrine alone at night. People would wait for someone else to go with them. They would stand outside the door longer than necessary. They would look around before walking in. You did not want to admit you were scared, because basic training is not exactly the place where you want to look weak. But everyone knew something about the building felt wrong. You could see it in how people acted. Nobody wanted the late shifts. Nobody wanted to be the last person awake. Nobody wanted to stand at the end of the bay alone. And nobody wanted to hear footsteps in the dark. The strangest part was still the people getting up and moving around in their sleep. I saw it happen more than once. Someone would suddenly sit up in their rack, swing their legs down, and stand there like they had just been called out. Their eyes would be open, but they would not look fully awake. They would seem focused on something in front of them that nobody else could see. Then they would start running laps around the bay. Not casually, not like someone sleepwalking slowly. They would move with purpose, like they were being smoked. Like a drill sergeant had told them they had messed up and needed to run until they dropped. The fire guard would try to stop them. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sometimes the person would say, "Drill sergeant told me to run." "Where?" "Right there," and they would point to an empty part of the room. Sometimes it was near the door, sometimes it was near the end of the bay, sometimes it was beside the lockers. But the description of the drill sergeant was always almost the same. A woman, short black hair, uniform, standing there with authority, watching, ordering them to move. It was enough to make even the people who did not believe in ghosts uncomfortable. Because people did not always know the full rumor before they had their experience. Some had heard bits and pieces. Some had only been told the barracks were haunted. But when they woke up, talking about a female drill sergeant with short, dark hair, it matched the story everyone had been whispering. That was when it stopped feeling like a simple prank. Nobody was sneaking into rooms wearing a drill sergeant uniform. Nobody had time for that. And even if someone did, there was no way they could appear separately to exhausted people in different bays, then vanish before fire guards saw them. At least not that anyone could explain. I have thought about it since then. The logical answer is probably sleep deprivation. Basic training does things to people. Lack of sleep can make you see things, hear things, wake up confused, have vivid dreams, and lose track of what is real for a few seconds. Stress makes it worse. Fear makes it worse. Being constantly yelled at makes your brain expect a drill sergeant to appear at any moment. It makes sense that people would dream about drill sergeants. It makes sense that they would wake up and start doing push-ups. It makes sense that they would hear commands in their sleep. It makes sense that 5 guys might all be on edge enough to mistake a sound for a fire alarm. It makes sense that pipes, vents, doors, or building noises could become loud bangs in a latrine. All of that makes sense. But what does not make sense is how consistent it felt. How many people had similar experiences? How often the same description came up? How people in different bays woke up thinking a drill sergeant had entered, even when no one was on fire guard and no actual drill sergeant was there. Maybe the rumors planted the image in everyone's mind. Maybe the building had a strange sound pattern that made people wake up at the same times. Maybe we were all just tired enough to scare ourselves. But when you are lying awake in a dark barracks, waiting for a female drill sergeant with short black hair to come through the door, logic does not help very much. You still hear every sound. You still watch the shadows. You still wonder whether someone is standing at the end of the bay. And you still hope that when somebody suddenly gets out of bed and starts doing push-ups, they are just dreaming. Because the other possibility is worse. I do not know what really happened at Fort Sill. Maybe the stories about suicides were only rumors. Maybe the female drill sergeant was never real. Maybe everything came from stress, fear, sleep deprivation, and the brutal rhythm of basic training. But I know people woke up for things that were not there. I know people ran laps because they believed they were ordered to. I know people heard alarms and bangs that others did not hear. And I know that more than one person described the same woman standing in the darkness. Short, black hair. A drill sergeant, still checking the barracks. Fuck Fort Sill. Some friends and I were doing a weekend of ice fishing a few years back. We had a nice spot on a local lake that was never too crowded, which was one of the main reasons we liked going there. It was far enough from the busiest public access area that you did not have people constantly driving snowmobiles nearby or setting up their houses 10 feet away from yours. You could actually relax, fish, drink a little, play cards, and enjoy being out on the lake without feeling like you were parked in a crowded winter campground. We had done trips like this before, so it was not a new experience for any of us. We knew how to set up the ice house, drill the holes, get the heater going, run the rattle reels, and make sure we had enough food, beer, bait, blankets, and firewood to last the weekend. It was one of those traditions that started as a casual idea and slowly became something we looked forward to every winter. Even when the fishing was slow, it was still a good excuse to get away from town for a few days. We got there on the first day in the early afternoon. The lake was open and white in every direction, with a few other ice houses scattered far away across the snow. The closest group to us was probably over 100 yards away. We could see them moving around near their setup, but we could not hear them clearly. Their dark shapes looked small against the huge frozen lake, and every once in a while we could see one of them walk outside or open the door to their shelter. Our spot was good. We had fished there before and usually had decent luck with walleye and northern pike. The ice was thick enough to feel safe, and the area was quiet. We unloaded the trucks, dragged the gear out, got the house in place, and started drilling holes before the sun got too low. It took a while, but that was part of the fun. Everyone had a job. One person set up the heater. Someone else worked on the lines. Another friend brought out the folding chairs and food. By the time we were done, the inside of the ice house was warm enough that we could take our gloves off. The first night was normal. We caught a few fish, drank some beer, cooked food on a little stove, and talked about the same things we always talked about on those trips. Work stories, old mistakes, people we knew, bad relationships, sports, and random memories from high school. Someone brought cards, and we played games when nobody felt like paying attention to the fishing lines. Every once in a while, one of the rattle reels would go off and someone would jump up to pull in a fish. There is a special kind of comfort inside an ice house when it is cold outside. The walls block the wind, the heater makes a steady soft noise, and you can hear little pops and groans from the lake ice beneath you. At first, those noises can make people nervous, especially if they have never been on a frozen lake before. But once you have been out there enough times, you get used to them. The lake shifts and settles. The ice expands and cracks somewhere far away. Sometimes it makes a deep, booming sound that seems to come from underneath your feet. It is strange, but normal. That first night, nothing happened that felt out of place. We went to sleep late, woke up early, and spent the next day fishing again. The weather was still good at first, though the sky had started looking heavier by the afternoon. The other group near us moved farther away on the second day. We noticed them packing up some of their gear and heading toward another area of the lake. We did not think much about it. Maybe the fishing had been bad where they were. Maybe they had friends somewhere else. Maybe they just wanted more distance. By the time the sun went down on the second night, a snowfall had started. At first, it was light. Small flakes drifted through the beams of our truck headlights as we went outside to check the holes and grab more supplies. Then it started coming down harder. It was not a full blizzard, but it was steady enough that the tracks around the house began filling in quickly. The lake, already white, became even brighter under the snow. The darkness beyond the ice house faded into a soft gray haze. Anyone who has spent time outdoors during a heavy snowfall knows how strange the quiet can get. Snow absorbs sound. It covers the hard surfaces and softens everything around you. A place that already feels empty can suddenly feel completely cut off from the world. You can stand outside and hear almost nothing. The usual distant noises disappear. Even the sound of the wind seems muted. That night, it got incredibly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. We had been drinking and playing games late into the night. Most of us were in a good mood. A couple of friends were arguing about rules to a game nobody really cared about. Someone had music playing softly from a phone, but it was low enough that we could still hear the rattle reels and the heater. Outside, the snow kept coming down. Every time the door opened, a burst of cold air came in, along with tiny flakes that clung to the floor. At some point, I looked at the time and realized it was much later than I thought. The lake outside was completely dark, except for the weak light from our ice house and the distant glow from the other group's setup far away. Their house had moved farther off on the second day, and now we could barely make out where they were through the falling snow. Then there was a knock on the door. It was not loud, but it was clear. 3 solid taps. Everyone stopped talking. For a second, we all looked at one another. The obvious thought was that someone from the other group needed something. Maybe they had run out of propane. Maybe one of their lines was messed up. Maybe they needed tools, bait, or a flashlight. People on the ice usually help each other out, especially at night. You do not ignore someone who might be in trouble. One of my friends got up and went to the door. He opened it right away. No one was there. The snowfall was thick enough that the light from inside the house only reached a short distance. Beyond that was white snow and darkness. My friend leaned out and looked both ways. He stepped down onto the ice and turned around slowly, scanning the area. Nothing. No person. No flashlight. No sound. No tracks. We all got up and looked outside. The snow around the ice house was fresh and deep enough that anyone who had walked to the door would have left obvious prints. They would have been impossible to miss. The snow was building up around our own tracks, but the newer ones were still visible. If someone had approached, there should have been a path leading away from the door. There was nothing but our own boot prints. The area around the house was smooth. We stood there for a minute, looking around as if someone might suddenly appear from the darkness. But there was nowhere for a person to hide. The lake was flat and open. There were no trees, no rocks, no banks, no buildings. The nearest other group was too far away. And even if someone had somehow run from their ice house to ours, they could not have gotten out of sight in the few seconds it took my friend to open the door. The snow was deep enough that moving quickly would have been difficult. Anybody who tried to run would be leaving a clear trail behind them. But there was no trail. Eventually, we shut the door. At first, we tried to laugh it off. One of us said maybe it had been the wind. Another said the door could have shifted. Maybe snow had slid from the roof. Maybe something hit the side of the house. The problem was that none of those explanations felt right. There was barely any wind that night. The lake was still. The snow came straight down. And the sound had been a knock, not a scrape, not a bump, not the sound of ice shifting. It was 3 clear taps at the door. Still, we kept drinking and tried to continue with the games. Nobody wanted to be the person who made the whole thing weird. People joked about it, but the mood had changed. We kept glancing at the door. Every time the heater clicked or the ice groaned below us, someone would pause for half a second. Eventually, people started going to sleep. We had sleeping bags and cots set up around the walls. The heater kept the inside warm enough that most of us could settle down comfortably. I was not fully asleep, but I had drifted off enough that I was not paying attention to much anymore. Then a rattle reel went off. The sound cut through the room sharply. Anyone who has used one knows what it sounds like. The little reel spins and rattles when a fish takes the line. It is loud enough to wake you up, especially in a small ice house. It was my turn to deal with the next fish, so I got up. I pulled on my boots, grabbed what I needed, and went over to the hole. The line was moving, and it felt like there was a decent fish on it. I started pulling it in slowly, careful not to lose it. After a few seconds, I saw the pale shape come up through the water. It was a good-sized walleye. Nothing huge, but definitely worth keeping. I pulled it through the hole, unhooked it, and set it aside. Everyone was half awake by then, looking over and asking how big it was. Somebody made a joke about it being the only fish we had caught all night. The whole moment felt normal, almost enough to make me forget about the knocking earlier. Then I figured I might as well go pee while I was already awake. I put my jacket on, opened the door, and stepped outside. The cold hit me hard. The snowfall had eased a little, but it was still coming down. The lake was almost completely silent. The only sound was the soft crunch of my boots as I walked away from the ice house. I only went maybe 20 feet from the door. You do not wander far at night on a frozen lake, especially when it is snowing, and visibility is not great. The light from the ice house was behind me. It made a soft yellow shape on the snow and threw a weak shadow in front of me. I stood there, facing away from the house. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then I heard a crunch in the snow. It sounded like it was right behind me, not far away, not near the other ice house, right behind me. It was the clear sound of a boot pressing into fresh snow. Crunch. I stopped. For a second, I did not turn around. I just stood there, listening. Nothing. Then I turned. There was nobody there. The ice house stood behind me, glowing softly in the snow. The lake stretched out beyond it into darkness. I looked left and right. I looked toward the distant group. I looked around the side of our house. Nothing. I looked down at the snow. There were only my own boot prints. The tracks led from the door to where I was standing. There were no other prints, no fresh marks, no path from anywhere else, no sign that someone had walked behind me. I stayed outside for a few more seconds, staring at the ground. I knew what I had heard. It had not sounded like snow falling. It had not sounded like the lake cracking. It sounded exactly like a step in the snow. I suddenly did not want to be outside anymore. I walked back toward the ice house quickly, following my own tracks. When I got to the door, I opened it and stepped inside. Everyone was awake. That alone was strange. Most of them had been asleep or close to it when I went out. But now they were sitting up, looking toward me. One of them asked why I had knocked on the door. I stared at him. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said all of them had heard someone knock while I was outside. They thought it was me messing around. They thought maybe I had come back, knocked to scare them, and then waited for someone to open it. I told them I had not touched the door until I came back in. They did not believe me at first. They said it had been clear. 3 knocks, just like before. I told them I had been about 20 feet away from the house. I had been outside the entire time. I had not walked around it. I had not gone near the door. I had no reason to knock and then stand outside in the snow. While I was saying that, while everyone was staring at me and trying to decide whether I was lying, the knock came again. 3 clear taps. Right on the door. Nobody moved. The whole ice house went silent. The heater hummed softly in the background. A line creaked near one of the holes. Someone shifted in a sleeping bag. But nobody said anything. Then one of my friends whispered. Nope. Nobody wanted to open the door this time. That was the difference. The first time, we thought someone might need help. The second time, after the prints outside and the sound behind me and the fact that everyone heard it while I was nowhere near the door, Nobody wanted to see who was out there. We sat there listening. Nothing happened for a while. Then the lake made one of those deep, shifting sounds under the ice. It was probably normal, but everybody jumped. Someone turned the music off completely. Someone else checked the door lock, even though we all knew a normal lock was not going to make us feel better about whatever had knocked. We stayed awake until dawn. Nobody really slept after that. We talked quietly. We tried to explain it. We said it could have been wind, even though there was barely any. We said maybe ice had shifted against the house, though it did not explain the sound behind me or why there were no tracks. We said maybe someone had come over from the other group, though nobody could explain where they went or how they left no footprints. Every explanation fell apart. As the sky slowly started getting lighter, the snow finally eased. The darkness around us began to lift, and we could see more of the lake again. It should have made us feel better, but it did not. We went outside once there was enough light and looked around the ice house carefully. There were still only our own tracks. No path leading to the door. No footprints circling the house. No marks behind where I had stood. Nothing. We had planned to stay one more night. We had enough food, enough gear, and enough time. Normally, the last day of a trip was the best part, because everyone had settled in and nobody was worrying about leaving yet. But none of us wanted to stay. The juju was just wrong. So we packed up. We broke down the ice house, loaded the gear, gathered the fish, and headed back toward shore. Nobody said much while we worked. The sun was up, the lake looked normal again, and the whole thing seemed less real in daylight. But every one of us had heard the knocks, and I had heard that crunch and the snow directly behind me. We still go ice fishing. None of us stopped doing it completely. But we never went back to that same spot for an overnight trip. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe there was some strange trick of sound on a quiet, snowy lake. Maybe the ice house shifted in a way that perfectly sounded like someone knocking. Maybe the snow hid tracks more quickly than we thought. But I know what it felt like that night when someone knocked on the door. There was nobody outside, and the snow around us was untouched. And I know that when the knock came a second time, nobody wanted to open the door. I used to have a huge backyard when I was younger. It was around 150 feet by 180 feet, so it was big enough that it never really felt like a normal yard. Most people had a simple patch of grass behind their house, maybe a small shed, a patio, a swing set, or a few trees along the fence. Our backyard was different. It had open space where my dog and I could run around. But farther toward the middle and back of the yard, there was this huge, overgrown section that I always called the forest. It was not an actual forest, of course, but when you were a kid, it felt like one. It took up a large part of the yard, maybe around 80 square feet, and it was packed with thick vegetation. There were tall weeds, bushes, old branches, vines, uneven patches of dirt, and plants that had grown into each other for so long that you could barely see through them. It was the kind of place where a ball could disappear and take 10 minutes to find. You could stand a few feet away from it and still not know what was inside. My parents never did much with it. I do not know if they planned to clean it out someday, or if it had just become one of those things that got ignored because there was always something more important to do. The yard was already big, and the forest area was far enough from the house that nobody really bothered with it. It just sat there, growing thicker every year. As a kid, I was curious about it, but I also did not like going too deep inside. I would walk around the edge of it, throw sticks into it for my dog, or stand near the opening and look around, but I never really pushed through the thicker parts. It was too dark in there, even during the day. The plants blocked a lot of the sunlight, and the branches made strange shadows on the ground. Sometimes there would be a rustling sound from inside, probably from squirrels, rabbits, birds, or whatever small animals lived in there, but it was always enough to make me stop and listen. My dog loved the backyard. He would run around like he owned the place, chasing anything that moved and barking at sounds that I could not hear. He would sprint across the grass, roll around in dry leaves, and then stop suddenly near the forest, staring into it like something was watching him from inside. Sometimes he would bark at the bushes, but most of the time he would just stand there with his ears up, completely focused. I used to think he was just being a dog. Then one day, something happened that I still think about. It was an ordinary afternoon. I do not remember the exact season, but it was warm enough to be outside and the yard was dry. I had gone into the backyard to play with my dog. Nothing felt strange at first. The sky was clear, the grass was bright, and the neighborhood was quiet in that normal way where you could hear distant lawnmowers, birds, and maybe cars passing somewhere beyond the houses. My dog was running around near me, and I was throwing something for him to chase. I was not paying attention to the forest at all. It was just there in the background, like it always was. Then, I heard rustling. At first, I ignored it. The forest was full of small animals. It was normal to hear leaves moving or branches shaking. Sometimes a bird would suddenly fly out. Sometimes my dog would scare a rabbit from the edge of the bushes. I did not think much about it until the sound happened again. This time, it was louder. It was not the light scratching sound of something small moving through leaves. It sounded heavy, like branches were being pushed aside, like someone or something large was moving quickly through the vegetation. My dog stopped running. That was the first thing that made me pay attention. He had been focused on playing, but suddenly he went still. His head turned toward the forest and his ears lifted. He did not bark right away. He just stared. Then the rustling came again. I turned my head toward the forest. For only a second, I saw something move. It was fast. I remember seeing what looked most likely like a person, or at least something large enough to be one. It was not clear enough for me to see a face or clothing. I did not see details. I just saw a shape moving through the thick plants, sprinting away from me in the opposite direction. It was too tall to be a dog. It was too fast and too upright to be a deer. It was not a shadow from the trees. Something was in there. For a second, I froze. My dog started barking and ran a few steps toward the forest, but he stopped before he got too close. He stood there, barking at the bushes, his body stiff, looking like he wanted to chase whatever it was, but did not want to go in after it. I stared at the area where I had seen the movement. The plants were still shaking. I could hear branches snapping deeper inside. Then, everything went quiet. I remember standing there and trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe it was someone who had jumped into our yard. Maybe someone had somehow climbed over the fence. But that did not make sense. Our fences were tall, around 7 feet, and they were not just regular wooden fences that someone could easily climb. They were solid, double-layer plastic fences. They were high, smooth, and difficult to get over. There was no gate open. There was no place where the fence was broken. There was no way I could see for a person to get in or out. I went closer to the edge of the forest, but not too close. I did not want to walk into it. I remember calling out, asking if anyone was there, but nobody answered. My voice sounded strange in the yard because everything else had gone quiet. My dog kept barking. I looked around the fence line. I checked the corners of the yard. I looked toward the back fence, then toward the sides. Nothing had changed. Everything was shut. Everything looked normal. but I knew I had seen something. Eventually, I got scared enough that I went back inside. I do not remember whether I told anyone right away. I probably tried to explain it, but it is hard to describe something when you only saw it for a second. I did not have a clear face, a clear body, or any proof. I just had that one strange moment where something big had moved through the forest and disappeared. After that, I never felt fully comfortable in that backyard again. During the day, it was usually fine. I would still go outside, I would still play with my dog, but I started watching the forest more closely. I would look toward it whenever I heard a branch move. I would stand farther away from it than I used to. If my dog started barking at it, I would call him back instead of letting him run around the edge. At night, I hated looking at it. The backyard was so large that the light from the house did not reach all the way to the back. The forest area turned into one big dark shape, almost like a wall. You could not see through it. You could not tell whether anything was inside it. Sometimes the wind would move the top branches, and it looked like something was shifting around in there. I would look out the window sometimes and imagine someone standing inside, watching the house through the gaps in the plants. I know that sounds dramatic, but after seeing something run in there, it became hard not to think about it. The worst part was that there were never any signs, no footprints that I could find, no trash, no broken fence, no obvious path through the vegetation. Nothing that proved someone had been there. Years passed, and eventually we were getting ready to move out of that house. Before we moved, the forest had to be taken out. I do not remember exactly why. Maybe the new owners wanted it cleared. Maybe my family decided it was finally time to deal with it. But whatever the reason was, people came in to remove all the overgrown vegetation. By then, the forest had become even thicker than it had been before. It had been left alone for so long that the plants had grown into a tangled mess. Once they started cutting through it, it became obvious that there was more space inside than anyone had realized. I remember watching parts of it come down. At first, it was just bushes and branches. Then, more of the center started to open up. The workers pulled out old wood, dead plants, thick roots, and piles of leaves that had probably been sitting there for years. Then, they found something near the middle. A hole. It was small and low to the ground, partly hidden under vegetation. It was not something you would notice if you were just looking at the forest from the outside. The opening was just large enough for a person to fit through if they crawled. That was when everything from that afternoon came back to me. The movement, the rustling, the large shape running away, the feeling that something had been in there. At first, nobody knew what the hole was. It could have been an animal den. It could have been some kind of drainage opening. But it looked too deliberate. It was too clean in shape, too deep, and too large for most animals that would normally be in a backyard. I remember feeling both scared and curious. The adults around me were looking at it, but nobody wanted to crawl inside right away. The opening was small enough that you had to get down low and move through it on your stomach. It was dirty, dark, and full of loose soil. You could not see very far inside without a light. But I wanted to know. Part of me was terrified that I would find an animal. Another part of me was convinced that I would find nothing. I think I wanted to prove to myself that the thing I had seen years earlier had not been real. So I army crawled into the hole. The dirt pressed into my clothes and arms as I moved forward. The entrance was tight enough that I could not turn around easily. I had to keep my head low and push myself slowly with my elbows and knees. The ground smelled damp and old. There was a strong smell of soil, rotting leaves, and something else that I could not identify at first. As I crawled farther in, the space opened up. It was not huge, but it was definitely big enough for someone to sit or lie down inside. There was a small underground area. I remember stopping as soon as I saw it. It was not an animal den. It was not some random hole in the ground. Someone had been living there. There was a water-damaged sleeping bag lying on the dirt. It was dark, stained, and looked like it had been there for a long time. There was a broken side table nearby, partly leaning against the dirt wall. There was also a bar stool, which made no sense at all. A bar stool sitting in a hidden underground space beneath the overgrown forest in our backyard. There were one or two food wrappers on the ground, too. That was all it took. That was proof. Somebody had been in our yard. Not just passing through. Not just hiding for a few minutes. Living there. I remember staring at the sleeping bag and feeling sick. The idea that someone had been sleeping in that tiny underground space was disturbing enough. But then, I started thinking about all the time they could have been there. How long had they lived there? Had they been there when I was outside playing? Had they watched me and my dog from inside the forest? Had they been there when my family was in the house? Had they been there when we were asleep? Did they know our routines? Did they know when people left for work or school? Did they come out at night? I had no answers. Nobody did. The more I thought about it, the stranger it became. The backyard was surrounded by tall, solid fences. I still do not know how someone got in. Maybe there was a way through that I never noticed. Maybe they climbed over the fence somehow. Maybe they had gotten in before the fencing was changed. Maybe they entered through a neighbor's yard. Maybe there was a gap somewhere hidden behind the vegetation. But I never found out. I also do not know how they dug out that space without anyone noticing. The forest was thick enough to hide a lot, but digging a place big enough for a person to crawl into and sleep in would take time. It would make noise. It would create piles of dirt. It would leave signs. Yet somehow, it had been there, right in the middle of our backyard. The more I thought about it, the more I remembered the day I saw that shape running away. It must have been him, or her, or whoever had been living there. I had gone outside with my dog, and they had heard us. Maybe they were moving around inside the forest. Maybe they had been trying to get farther away from the house. Maybe they panicked when they realized I saw them. Maybe they ran deeper into the vegetation and hid inside the underground space. That would explain why I could not find anyone. That would explain why there was no way out. They had never left the yard. They had just gone underground. For years after we moved, I thought about that place. It bothered me more than most ghost stories ever could, because it was real. There was no paranormal explanation. There was no strange shadow in the hallway, no mystery sound from an empty room, no creepy figure that disappeared into thin air. There was a person, a real person. Someone had found a way into our yard, hidden inside the thick, overgrown forest, and made a small living space underground without anyone noticing. I never learned who it was. I never learned how long they had been there. I never learned how they got in or whether they ever came into the house. I never learned whether the person was dangerous, homeless, scared, hiding from someone, or simply using the space because they had nowhere else to go. All I know is that I saw something large run through the forest that day. And years later, we found proof that someone had been there all along. I was around 4 or 5 years old when this happened, so most of my memories from that age are blurry and incomplete. There are entire years from my early childhood that I barely remember at all. Faces, conversations, and ordinary days have faded away with time. Yet for some reason, this particular memory has stayed with me. It has remained clear for decades. sitting in the back of my mind like a photograph that never quite fades. I have thought about it many times over the years, and even now I still don't know what to make of it. At the time, my cousin and his mom had come to stay with my family for a few weeks. They lived far enough away that visits like this didn't happen very often, so everyone was excited. As kids, my cousin and I got along well. He was a little older than me, around 6 or 7 years old, while I was somewhere between 4 and 5. At that age, even a couple of years feels like a huge difference. I looked up to him because he seemed older, smarter, and braver than I was. Since he was staying at our house, it was decided that he would sleep in my room. To us, this felt more like an adventure than an inconvenience. We spent our days playing together, watching cartoons, running around the house, and doing all the things young kids do when they're excited to have company their own age. My bedroom wasn't very large, but to me it felt like my own little world. It was filled with toys, books, and stuffed animals that had collected over the years. Some sat on shelves, some were piled into a corner, and others were scattered around, depending on what I had been playing with that day. Looking back, there was nothing unusual about any of them. They were normal, stuffed animals, the kind almost every kid owns. One of them was larger than the others. It stood about 15 or 16 inches tall and sat near the side of the room where it could easily be seen from my bed. During the daytime, it looked harmless. It was one of those toys that had a permanent smile stitched into its face. It wasn't creepy, strange, or damaged in any way. If someone had looked at it during the day, they would have seen nothing more than a regular stuffed animal. One night during my cousin's stay, we went to bed as usual. I don't remember anything special about that evening. There were no scary movies, no ghost stories, and no conversations that might have put strange ideas into our heads. It was just another normal night. Eventually, we both fell asleep. Sometime during the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know what caused it. Maybe I heard a noise. Maybe I shifted position in my sleep. Maybe it happened for no reason at all. Whatever the cause, I suddenly found myself awake in the darkness. For a few moments, I simply lay there. The room was quiet. My cousin was asleep nearby. The house itself seemed completely silent. There was no sound of people moving around, no television playing in another room, no voices coming from downstairs. Everything was still. As I tried to fall back asleep, I found myself doing what many children do when they wake up at night. I started looking around the room. At first, everything appeared normal. The dresser was where it always was. The shelves were unchanged. The toys were sitting exactly where they had been before we went to sleep. But the longer I stared into the darkness, the more unusual things began to look. Anyone who has spent time awake in a dark room knows what I mean. Objects don't always look the way they do during the daytime. Shadows distort shapes. Details disappear. Your brain fills in missing information. A pile of clothes can suddenly look like a person standing in the corner. A chair can resemble an animal crouching in the dark. Even as a child, I understood this to some degree. That was why I wasn't immediately frightened. Then my eyes settled on the stuffed animal. At first, it looked normal. Then, something seemed off. I couldn't explain exactly what was wrong. There was just a strange feeling that came over me. The toy didn't appear quite the same as it usually did. I kept staring. The longer I looked, the more convinced I became that its face was changing. Its friendly expression seemed to disappear. Instead, it looked like it was frowning. Not slightly, not vaguely. It genuinely appeared to be angry. I remember blinking several times because I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Every time I looked away and looked back, the feeling remained. The toy seemed different. Worse than that, it looked alive. I know how ridiculous that sounds. Even today, saying it out loud feels absurd. But that's exactly what I thought at the time. The expression on its face appeared to shift, little by little. Its mouth looked tighter. Its eyes seemed different. The entire face carried an expression that I had never seen before. Then, I noticed what scared me the most. The teeth. The toy appeared to be pulling back its lips and baring its teeth. Not in a smile, not in a playful way. It looked like an angry dog preparing to growl. I remember feeling a cold wave of fear rush through my body. One moment, I was simply awake. The next moment, I felt completely terrified. I couldn't stop staring at it. Part of me wanted to look away. Another part felt frozen. I kept hoping that if I stared long enough, the illusion would disappear and everything would go back to normal. Instead, it only seemed more real. The stuffed animal looked angry, hostile, almost threatening. I knew it wasn't possible. I knew toys couldn't move. I knew stuffed animals couldn't make facial expressions. Yet every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Finally, fear won. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see it anymore. I remember pulling my blanket closer and keeping my eyes firmly closed. I was too afraid to open them again. I didn't want to check whether the expression had changed. I didn't want to see if it was still staring at me. So I stayed perfectly still. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. Everything looked normal again. The darkness was gone. The strange shadows were gone. And the stuffed animal looked exactly as it always had. Its friendly expression had returned. It seemed harmless, ordinary, completely incapable of doing any of the things I thought I had seen the night before. Once daylight arrived, the experience seemed silly. I laughed about it internally. After all, I was a child. Children imagine things. Darkness changes how objects appear. I assumed my mind had simply played a trick on me. In fact, I found the whole thing funny enough that I wanted to tell my cousin about it. I wasn't planning to present it as something supernatural. I wasn't planning to claim the toy was actually alive. I simply thought it was a weird thing that had happened during the night. Later that morning, I found my cousin and started telling him about it. I began explaining how I had woken up during the night. As I talked, I noticed his expression changing. At first, he looked confused. Then he looked surprised. Then, something else appeared on his face. Fear. Real fear. I hadn't even reached the part about the stuffed animal's face yet. I was still describing waking up in the dark. Before I could continue, he interrupted me. His eyes widened. His face went pale. Then he said something that immediately made my stomach drop. He told me that he had also woken up during the night. I remember staring at him. Before I could say another word, he continued. He said that he had looked across the room and seen the stuffed animal. Then he described exactly what I had seen. He said it looked like it was making faces at him. He said it appeared to be frowning. And then he said it seemed to be baring its teeth like an angry dog. For several seconds, I couldn't respond. I was stunned. The details matched perfectly. I hadn't told him those details. I hadn't mentioned the frown. I hadn't mentioned the teeth. I hadn't described the angry expression. Yet somehow he was describing exactly what I remembered seeing. At first I thought he must be joking. It seemed like the only reasonable explanation. Kids tease each other all the time. Maybe he was trying to scare me. Maybe he was making things up after seeing my reaction. But when I looked at him, he didn't seem like he was joking. He looked genuinely disturbed. I asked him if he was serious. He immediately insisted that he was. The more we talked, the more convinced I became that he wasn't lying. He described waking up. He described noticing the stuffed animal. He described feeling uncomfortable. and he described the exact same facial expressions I remembered seeing. The conversation left both of us unsettled. What had seemed funny moments earlier suddenly wasn't funny anymore. If I had been the only one to experience it, I would have dismissed it completely. But now there were two of us. Two children who claimed to have seen the same thing during the same night. Eventually, we decided to tell our parents. We found them and explained everything. We described waking up. We described seeing the stuffed animal. We described the angry expression. And we explained how we had both witnessed the same thing independently. As you might expect, our parents weren't particularly concerned. They listened. They smiled. Then they dismissed it as childhood imagination. Looking back, I understand why. From an adult perspective, their reaction made perfect sense. Two young children wake up in a dark room. Both become frightened by shadows. Both interpret a stuffed animal's appearance in a similar way. Nothing supernatural required. Case closed. At the time, we accepted their explanation. What else could we do? We were kids. Adults always seemed to have answers. Life moved on. The visit eventually ended. My cousin and his mom returned home. The stuffed animal remained where it had always been. And nothing similar ever happened again. Years passed. Then, decades. Most childhood memories faded. Yet, this one remained. Even now, I can remember the feeling of lying awake in that dark room. I can remember staring at the stuffed animal. I can remember the sensation of fear slowly building in my chest. Most of all, I remember the conversation the following morning. That conversation is the reason the story has stayed with me all these years. I've spent a lot of time trying to explain it. The logical side of me believes there must be a reasonable answer. Perhaps the lighting created the same illusion for both of us. Perhaps our brains interpreted the shadows in an identical way. Perhaps the stuffed animal's features naturally looked aggressive under certain conditions. Those explanations are entirely possible, maybe even likely. But no matter how many logical possibilities I consider, one detail always stands out. My cousin described the facial expressions before I did. That is the part I struggled to explain. If I had described everything first, then his agreement would mean very little. Memory is suggestible. Children influence each other easily. But that isn't how it happened. He volunteered the details before hearing them from me. The frown, the teeth, the angry expression. Every important detail matched. That single fact is what has kept the memory alive all these years. I'm not saying the stuffed animal was haunted. I'm not saying anything supernatural happened. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe it was a strange coincidence. Maybe two children saw the same visual illusion at different times during the night. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary explanation that neither of us has considered. All I know is that the memory remains as vivid now as it was then. Whenever I think about it, I still feel the same small sense of unease. Not terror, not panic, just uncertainty. The kind that comes from encountering something you can't fully explain. To this day, I still remember that stuffed animal sitting in the darkness, looking completely different from the harmless toy I knew during the day. And even after all these years, I still don't know what to make of it. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.